My name is Emma Miller. I am 35 years old, a forensic financial analyst, and a ghost in my own family. 3 weeks ago, I stood under the crystal chandeliers of the Boston Harbor Hotel Grand Ballroom, holding a worn leather portfolio against my hip. I had been in the room for less than 4 minutes when my mother found me. "How dare you sneak in here?" The words did not echo. Patricia Miller never shouted. She wielded her voice like a scalpel, designed to cut precisely without disturbing the surrounding elite. She crossed the hand-knotted rug in a designer gown, the emeralds at her throat catching the ambient light. Before I could brace myself, she raised her hand and struck my face. The slap sounded like a cracked whip over the low hum of the hired string quartet. My jaw jarred sideways. A sharp sting radiated down my neck, carrying the scent of her signature jasmine perfume and cold cash. I did not drop the portfolio. I did not reach for my cheek to soothe the burn. I just turned my head back to center and met her eyes. 3 security guards in tailored black suits materialized from the perimeter, their earpieces buzzing. My father arrived a second later. William Miller did not look at my red cheek or the guards. He seized my elbow, his fingers digging into the fabric of my dress, dragging me half a step toward the service doors. "Leave through the kitchen," he hissed, his teeth clenched shut. "Do not embarrass this family tonight. We are closing the Vanguard deal." Standing 6 feet behind him was my younger sister, Harper. She wore a champagne silk dress and a diamond tennis bracelet she had not earned. Her lips curved into a thin, practiced smile. She thought this was the end of the disruption. They all thought I was the same terrified 27-year-old they had erased from their lives 8 years prior. They believed the leather portfolio held a desperate plea for a handout or an apology letter trying to buy my way back into their good graces. They had no idea I had spent the last 8 months mapping every offshore account, every forged signature, and every stolen line of code that built Harper's fake tech empire. They did not know the documents under my arm could trigger federal indictments before dessert was served. Most importantly, my parents did not realize that the guest of honor, the man whose signature they needed to secure their future, had already read every page. One of the security guards reached for my shoulder. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." I did not move. A chair scraped hard against the marble floor. The sound cut through the rising tension, sharp and metallic. Harrison Cole, the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, stood up from the center VIP table. He buttoned his jacket slowly. The ballroom grew quiet. He did not look at Harper, the supposed prodigy he was about to acquire. He did not look at my mother. He stared directly at William. Cole raised a single hand, signaling the guards to stop. "Do you know who she is?" he asked. The silence stretched. My mother's calculated fury faltered. My father's grip on my elbow loosened, his eyes dropping from Cole's face to the leather portfolio tucked under my arm. For the first time in my life, I watched fear rewrite my father's posture. Before I tell you what happened when the music stopped, welcome to QT Told Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from today. I want to know how far this story reaches. 8 years before Harrison Cole interrupted that gala, I sat in my father's home office in Weston. The room smelled of old leather and the expensive scotch he poured whenever he was about to finalize a difficult transaction. I was 27 years old. I was a rising data analyst at a respected firm in the city. I was also 6 weeks pregnant. The man who had promised to marry me had vanished the moment I showed him the positive test result. I walked into my parents' house that night seeking a sanctuary. I found a boardroom instead. My younger sister Harper was 23. She had just secured her first junior executive role at a competing financial group, a position my father orchestrated through his golf club connections. Harper had always been the golden child, the reflection my parents preferred. But 3 days earlier, Harper made a critical error. She bypassed internal firewalls to access restricted client portfolios, using the data to advise one of my father's venture capital partners on a real estate acquisition. It was a severe compliance violation. It was corporate espionage. If the truth surfaced, Harper would face prison, and my father's financial reputation would shatter overnight. William Miller did not do scandal. He did damage control. He sat behind his heavy mahogany desk. My mother stood near the window, her arms folded tightly across a cashmere sweater. Neither of them offered me a seat or a glass of water. Neither of them asked how I was feeling. My father slid a beige folder across the polished wood. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a non-disclosure agreement. The second was a resignation letter drafted on my behalf, claiming I was stepping down due to personal health struggles. Attached to them was a severance check. "I need you to sign these, Emma," my father said. His voice was level, the exact tone he used to negotiate commercial leases. I read the first page. The documents confessed to the data breach. They transferred every ounce of Harper's guilt onto my shoulders. I looked at my mother. She stared back with eyes as cold as river stones, waiting for me to obey. "You want me to take the fall for a crime I did not commit?" I said. "You want me to destroy my career so Harper can keep hers?" My father leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You are already destroying your career. You walked in here pregnant and unmarried. You are a liability. Harper has a pristine trajectory. She made a careless mistake. You made a lifestyle choice that will humiliate this family. Sign the paper. We will deposit the check. You will quietly relocate to a clinic in upstate New York, handle the pregnancy issue, and start over somewhere else." Handle the pregnancy issue. Those 4 words hung in the air, dense and suffocating. They were not asking me to hide. They were commanding me to erase my child to protect their public image. They weighed the life growing inside me against Harper's fake tech prodigy status and found my baby worthless. I closed the folder. I pushed it back across the desk. "I will not sign a confession," I said, "and I am keeping my daughter." The silence that followed was heavy. My father did not yell. He simply reached out and took the folder. He opened a desk drawer, dropped the documents inside, and locked it with a sharp click. "Then you are no longer my daughter," he said. By sunrise, William Miller removed my name from the family trust. He revoked my access to the emergency accounts. My mother went to work immediately on the narrative. In her social circles, a pregnant, discarded daughter raised uncomfortable questions. An unstable addict elicited sympathy. Patricia spent the next month attending charity luncheons and art galas, wiping away artificial tears while whispering to her friends that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown. She told the people who mattered that I had fallen into substance abuse and run away, forcing the family to cut ties for their own safety. It was a brilliant, devastating lie. It protected Harper. It shielded my father. It explained my sudden absence from the financial sector. When hiring managers checked my background, the quiet rumors of instability followed. Doors closed before I could even knock on them. Survival became my only focus. I moved into a cramped 4th-floor walk-up apartment in Somerville. The heating pipes clanked all night, and the single window in the living room looked out at a brick wall. I took a job processing data entry at a medical billing company on the night shift. During the day, I rocked Sophie to sleep while reading forensic accounting textbooks on my kitchen counter. Those years were a quiet, grinding kind of brutal. I learned the exact price of diapers and the specific anxiety of a glowing check engine light. I learned how to stretch a pound of ground turkey over 3 dinners. I learned how to code while holding a teething infant against my chest, typing with one hand while walking circles around a tiny living room. I did not attend holiday dinners. I did not receive birthday cards. My family traded my existence for a pristine public image, and I let them. I believed staying in the shadows was the price of keeping my daughter safe. I poured every ounce of my energy into building a quiet, bulletproof career. I mastered forensic financial analysis. I learned how to track hidden assets, unravel shell companies, and expose corporate fraud. I built a life that required no favors and no inherited wealth. I thought the past was finished with me. Then, 8 years later, a junior analyst at my new firm dropped a prospectus on my desk. We were conducting preliminary market research on startups seeking acquisition. "Look at this new interface," the analyst said. "The architecture is brilliant. Vanguard Holdings is preparing to acquire them for an 8-figure sum next quarter." I opened the glossy brochure. Staring back at me was a proprietary algorithm structure. It was an advanced predictive modeling tool designed to optimize supply chain logistics. I recognized the code immediately. I knew the sequence because I had written it. 8 years ago, before the exile, I developed that specific algorithm prototype during my late nights at the office. I kept it on a private, encrypted drive, intending to pitch it when I earned a promotion. I turned the page of the prospectus. There was a full-page photograph of my sister. Harper stood in a sleek, modern office, arms crossed, smiling the same practiced smile she wore the night they threw me out. The text below the photograph named Harper Miller as the sole creator, founder, and chief executive officer of the startup. My family had not just erased me. They had raided the digital assets I left behind in my old bedroom. Harper took the prototype I built, slapped her name on it, and used my father's venture capital money to market it as her own genius. Now they were standing on the edge of a lucrative payout from Vanguard Holdings, built entirely on my stolen intellectual property. They thought I was still the broken, terrified girl they chased out of Weston. They thought I was too busy surviving to notice they were selling my ghost. I sat at my desk and looked at Harper's smiling face. The radiator in my office hissed. The low hum of the servers vibrated through the floorboards. I did not feel the sting of betrayal. I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt cold. I felt sharp. I picked up a red pen and circled Harper's name on the brochure. I did not storm into my father's office demanding justice. I did not call a lawyer to draft a cease and desist letter. I knew how my father operated. A legal threat would only give him time to bury the evidence and hire a team of attorneys to drain my resources. He would use his wealth to drag me into a drawn-out court battle while quietly pushing the Vanguard acquisition across the finish line. I needed to move silently. I needed to gather indisputable proof of the theft before they even knew I was looking. I opened a blank, encrypted file on my computer and titled it Vanguard. I stared at the blinking cursor, tracing the path backward in my mind. If Harper had stolen the prototype, she had to have left a digital footprint. If my father funded her, the money trail existed somewhere in his tangled web of venture capital accounts. I just needed to find the thread and pull it until their entire carefully constructed image unraveled. I had spent 8 years learning how to dismantle financial empires from the inside out. My parents had spent 8 years believing their own lies. They were about to learn that the daughter they threw away had become the exact type of predator they should have feared. The shadow investigation began that afternoon. The shadow investigation required a specific kind of silence. I could not use my primary workstation at the firm to run inquiries on my father's holding companies. Corporate networks leave digital fingerprints, and William Miller paid exceptional people to monitor his perimeter. Instead, I stayed late on a Tuesday, waiting until the office emptied, and walked down to the basement server room. That is where I found David Sterling. David was 45, an independent cybersecurity contractor and audiovisual specialist who preferred the hum of cooling fans to human conversation. He owed me a favor. 2 years prior, I helped him quietly untangle a tax discrepancy that would have cost him his house. He never forgot the gesture. I handed him a plain black flash drive containing the public promotional materials for Harper's tech startup. "Find the origin of the source code," I said, "and trace the initial Series A funding." David did not ask questions. He plugged the drive into an offline terminal. For 3 weeks, we worked in the margins of the night. While my parents hosted charity dinners and Harper posed for magazine profiles, David and I pulled apart their digital infrastructure line by line. What we found was not just intellectual property theft. It was a functioning financial syndicate. My original algorithm was designed to predict supply chain failures. Harper had taken my code, but she did not understand the underlying mathematics. To keep the software appearing functional for early investors, she had hired a team of offshore developers to patch the gaps. but the patches were failing under the weight of real data. The product Vanguard Holdings wanted to buy was a digital house of cards. That was only the first layer. The real crime was buried in the accounting. I traced the venture capital funds flowing into Harper's startup. Investors believed their millions were financing server space, talent acquisition, and global marketing. Instead, I watched the money move through a labyrinth of shell companies, registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I spent 4 nights deciphering the routing numbers. The funds were not staying in the startup. They were being siphoned out as fake consulting fees and bloated vendor invoices. The destination for those phantom invoices was a holding entity called Oak Crest Partners. I pulled the corporate registry for Oak Crest. The primary beneficiaries were William and Patricia Miller. My sister had not merely stolen my work to play the role of a tech visionary. She was acting as a funnel. My parents were using her startup to bleed investor capital directly into their own pockets, sustaining the luxurious lifestyle they could no longer afford through legitimate means. The deficit was staggering. $20 million had vanished over 3 years. I printed the bank ledgers, slipped them into a manila envelope, and drove home to Somerville. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The apartment was quiet. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the small overhead light. Sophie was still asleep in the next room. She was 8 years old now, with a missing front tooth and a laugh that filled every empty space in my life. I stood at the laminate counter and started making her lunch. I spread peanut butter on whole wheat bread. I cut the sandwich into triangles because she preferred the corners. I washed a handful of strawberries and packed them into a small blue container. I wrote a note on a yellow sticky pad telling her I loved her and slipped it inside the lunchbox. My hands moved with practiced rhythm. I looked down at the simple plastic lunchbox and thought about my mother. Patricia Miller never packed a lunch. She viewed motherhood as a public relations campaign. Affection was transactional, measured in country club photo opportunities and quiet obedience. If a child did not elevate the family brand, the child was discarded. I pulled the manila envelope full of fraudulent bank records out of my bag and set it next to Sophie's lunchbox. I was not just protecting my stolen code anymore. I was protecting the quiet, safe life I had built for my daughter. I refused to let William and Patricia fund their arrogance with a lie that bore my original signature. The tension shifted 2 days later. I was sitting at my desk when a notification chimed on my monitor. It was an email forwarded from a junior partner at a private equity firm I occasionally consulted for. The partner was careless known for hitting reply all without checking the recipient list. He was seeking my advice on a minor tech sector trend, but he had included a chain of prior correspondence. I scrolled down the thread and froze. The emails were between my father and the core investment group backing Harper's startup. William was panicked. His tone in the emails was dressed up as aggressive corporate strategy, but I knew his cadence. He was pushing the investors to waive the standard 90-day due diligence period for the Vanguard acquisition. He cited rapid market changes and fake competing offers, insisting that Vanguard needed to sign the final paperwork by the end of the month. I read the dates. The Vanguard Gala was scheduled for 3 weeks from that Friday. The pieces locked into place. My father knew the software was failing. He knew the $20 million was missing. If Vanguard conducted a standard forensic audit before signing the acquisition, they would find the empty shell companies. William needed Harrison Cole to sign the binding purchase agreement at the Gala, effectively transferring the toxic debt and the fraudulent product onto Vanguard's balance sheet before anyone looked under the hood. It was a classic exit scam wrapped in a black tie celebration. I printed the email chain. I sat in my office as the afternoon sun slanted through the blinds. A traditional lawsuit would take years. If I filed an intellectual property claim, my father would tie me up in depositions while he finalized the Vanguard deal. Once he secured the payout, he would have infinite resources to crush me in court. The legal system favored the wealthy, and William Miller knew how to manipulate the scales. I could not just sue them. I had to dismantle their credibility on their biggest stage. I had to corner them in a room where their money could not buy the exits. I needed the one man who had the power to freeze the acquisition instantly. I called David Sterling. I told him I needed a direct, unmonitored line to the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. David spent 3 hours bypassing corporate switchboards and executive assistants, utilizing back channels he never explained to me. At 4 p.m, he handed me a piece of paper with a single phone number written in black ink. I dialed the number. The line rang twice. A deep, measured voice answered. Harrison Cole speaking. My pulse remained steady. I did not introduce myself as William Miller's discarded daughter. I did not sound bitter or afraid. I spoke with the cold precision of a senior forensic analyst. Mr. Cole, my name is Emma Miller. You are currently finalizing a 9-figure acquisition of a logistics startup fronted by Harper Miller. There was a pause on the line. I do not take unscheduled calls regarding pending acquisitions, Ms. Miller. Contact my legal department. Before he could disconnect, I delivered the anchor. Your legal department does not know that the core algorithm you are buying is stolen property, I said. They also do not know that the target company is currently hiding a $20 million deficit through a network of offshore shell accounts controlled by William Miller. If you sign those papers next week, Vanguard absorbs the fraud. The silence on the line grew heavy. The background noise of Cole's office disappeared. How do you know this? He asked, his tone dropping an octave. Because I wrote the original code, I replied, and I have the bank routing numbers sitting on my desk. I am willing to hand you every piece of evidence, but we do it my way. Harrison Cole did not become a billionaire by trusting people. He built Vanguard Holdings by seeing the angles everyone else missed. 2 days after my phone call, I walked into the Vanguard headquarters in the financial district. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was sterile, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the Boston Harbor. Cole sat at the head of a long marble table. He wore a charcoal suit and a watch that cost more than my first house. He did not offer small talk. I opened the manila envelope and laid the documents across the cold marble. I placed the original source code algorithm next to the patched version Harper was pitching. Beside those, I fanned out the bank ledgers, highlighting the $20 million deficit and the offshore routing numbers tied to Oakcrest Partners. Cole put on his reading glasses. He spent 20 minutes reviewing the paperwork in total silence. The only sound in the room was the crisp turn of paper and the low hum of the climate control system. I watched his jaw tighten. He was a man who hated being played. William Miller had tried to package a toxic, fraudulent asset and sell it to Vanguard as a flagship acquisition. These routing numbers are confirmed, Cole asked, tapping a polished silver pen against the final ledger. Verified through 3 separate banking nodes, I replied. My father is rushing the closing date to bypass your final forensic audit. If you sign the acquisition papers next Friday, Vanguard absorbs the missing capital. By the time your accountants find the hole, the Miller family will have cashed out their equity and disappeared behind a wall of corporate immunity. Cole took off his glasses. He looked at me with a new, distinct level of respect. He did not ask why I was handing him the sword to execute my own flesh and blood. He only cared about the math and the liability. If Vanguard terminates the letter of intent without public cause, our stock takes a hit, Cole stated. The market expects this merger. If we back out quietly, your father will spin the narrative. He will tell the financial press that Vanguard lacks liquid capital or that we tried to renegotiate the terms in bad faith. We need an undeniable breach of contract to walk away clean. That is why we are going to expose them in public, I said. I outlined the strategy. The acquisition gala was scheduled to take place at the Boston Harbor Hotel. The guest list included 300 venture capitalists, tech journalists, and state politicians. It was the exact audience my parents needed to cement their legacy. It was also the perfect trap. If we confronted them in private, William would drag Vanguard into years of arbitration, sealing the evidence behind closed doors. If we unveiled the fraud under the ballroom lights, with the media already in the room, the Miller empire would disintegrate in real time. Vanguard would be protected as the victim who uncovered the deception, rather than the partner who enabled it. Cole leaned back in his leather chair. A grim, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You handle the execution," Cole agreed. "I will ensure my security detail lets you in the building. Do not miss your mark, Emma. If you falter, your father will ruin us both." I gathered the documents and returned them to the envelope. "I do not falter," I told him. The trap was set. Now I needed to ensure my family felt secure enough to walk into it. To maintain the element of surprise, I had to behave exactly like the broken, discarded daughter they believed I was. I needed to rattle their cage just enough to make them confident in their own superiority. I returned to my apartment that evening and sat on the edge of my bed. The room was dark. I unlocked my phone and scrolled down to a contact name I had not touched in 8 years. Patricia. The cursor blinked in the empty message field. Breaking an 8-year silence carried a heavy physical weight. My thumb hovered over the screen. I drafted a simple, polite message designed to sound pathetic. "Mom, I saw the news about the Vanguard deal. I am so proud of Harper. I would like to attend the gala on Friday to support her. Please let me come." I hit send. The response took less than 4 minutes. I watched the 3 gray typing bubbles appear, vanish, and reappear. Patricia Miller did not waste time playing the role of a grieving mother in private. Her reply was a single surgical strike. "Harper's moment is not your therapy session. Stay home." There was no greeting. There was no inquiry about my well-being or her granddaughter. It was a cold, direct dismissal. I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar chill of her conditional love. I did not type a response. I just took a screenshot and saved it to a secure folder. 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my palm. An incoming call from William Miller. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I wanted him to leave a recording. I needed his voice on tape offering the exact brand of poison he specialized in. I waited 2 minutes, then tapped the playback button and held the speaker to my ear. "Emma, it is your father." William spoke in a hushed, urgent tone, performing the role of a concerned patriarch. "Your mother told me you reached out. Listen to me very carefully. You are not well enough to attend an event of this magnitude. The stress will trigger a relapse, and I will not have you causing a scene in front of our investors. If you agree to stay away from the hotel on Friday, I will wire $5,000 to your checking account. Use it for your recovery programs. Do not force me to involve security. This is for your own good." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I sat in the quiet dark of my bedroom and played the message a second time. $5,000. That was the current market value of my absence. He was offering a bribe disguised as fatherly care. He was using the fake addiction narrative they invented 8 years ago to control my movements today. He wanted to keep me hidden, not because he feared a relapse, but because he feared the truth. I did not argue. I did not call him back to demand an apology. I simply saved the audio file next to Patricia's text message. Their cruelty was no longer a wound. It was evidence. Let me pause right here for a second. If you have ever had a parent or a relative weaponize the word concern just to keep you silent, or if they have ever used your struggles as a convenient excuse to hide their own toxic behavior, hit that like button and drop the word weapon in the comments. I want to see how many of you know exactly what that voicemail felt like. The days leading up to the gala passed with agonizing slowness. I continued my daily routine. I dropped Sophie off at elementary school, went to my office, ran forensic diagnostics, and cooked dinner. I maintained the rhythm of a normal life while standing on the edge of a controlled demolition. Friday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky. The air over Boston felt thick and expectant. I woke up at 5 in the morning. The apartment was silent. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the garment bag hanging on the back of the door. I unzipped the bag and pulled out the dress. It was a tailored black gown, structured and unyielding. It did not feature excessive lace or bright colors. It was a garment designed for a funeral, which felt appropriate for the evening ahead. I laid it flat on the bed next to the worn leather portfolio. Inside that portfolio sat the bank ledgers, the patent filings, the source code, and the printed email chains. Every lie my family had told for 8 years was reduced to black ink on white paper, waiting to be read. I showered, letting the hot water wash away the last traces of anxiety. I dried my hair, pulling it back into a tight, severe knot at the base of my neck. I applied minimal makeup. I did not want to look like I was trying to fit into their world. I wanted to look like the consequence they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. I stepped into the black gown and pulled the zipper up the back. The fabric pulled tight across my ribs, serving as physical armor. I picked up the leather portfolio and tucked it firmly under my right arm. The leather was cool against my skin. I walked into the hallway and looked at my reflection in the narrow mirror. I did not see the terrified 27-year-old girl who cried in a home office in Weston. I saw a senior forensic analyst ready to execute a hostile takeover of her own family history. The trap was set, the bait was taken. It was time to go to the party. The Boston Harbor Hotel sat against the waterfront like a fortress of illuminated glass and stone. The evening air off the harbor carried a sharp chill biting through the thin fabric of my coat as I walked toward the service entrance. I did not walk up the main steps. I did not hand my keys to the valet. I bypassed the front door check-in entirely. David Sterling had provided a laminated vendor pass attached to a black lanyard. I clipped it to my collar and walked past the loading dock security guard with my head down. He barely glanced at the plastic badge before waving me through the double metal doors. I navigated the labyrinth of narrow corridors designated for catering staff and audio technicians. The concrete floors gave way to thick carpeting. The smell of industrial cleaner faded, replaced by the heavy scent of roasted tenderloin and expensive floral arrangements. I pushed open a discreet side door and stepped into the shadows at the edge of the grand ballroom. The atmosphere dripped with an aggressive kind of wealth. The ceiling featured massive crystal chandeliers casting a warm amber glow over 300 guests. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. I stood near a towering column wrapped in white roses, pressing my back against the cool plaster and observed the room. I focused on the pebbles. I listened to the high-pitched clinking of crystal flutes. I watched the specific angle of the lighting, designed to flatter aging faces. I tuned into the ambient noise of 100 overlapping conversations. It was a symphony of mutual deception. Everyone in the room was pretending to be slightly richer, slightly smarter, and slightly more important than they actually were. My eyes found my family. They were holding court near the center stage. My father stood in a circle of state senators and venture capitalists. William Miller wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He threw his head back and released a loud, booming laugh at a joke a politician made. It was a sound I knew intimately. It was his closing laugh. It contained no actual joy. It was a calculated vocal performance designed to signal dominance and ease. He was celebrating a victory he believed was already secured in ink. A few yards away, my sister Harper leaned against a tall cocktail table. She was speaking to a prominent technology journalist. Harper held a glass of sparkling water, gesturing playfully as she talked. The ballroom lights caught the diamonds wrapped around her left wrist. The tennis bracelet was new. It sparkled with flawless clarity. I stared at the jewelry and felt my stomach tighten. That bracelet was not a gift from a successful startup. It was purchased with the funds siphoned from the offshore shell accounts. She was wearing the stolen equity of the investors, standing right next to her. And then I saw my mother. Patricia Miller glided through the crowd like a monarch inspecting her subjects. She wore her emerald necklace and a flawless expression of gracious humility. She touched the arms of the guests she greeted, projecting the image of the perfect matriarch. Growing up, Patricia drilled us on this exact choreography. We were taught how to stand, how to smile without showing too much teeth, and how to memorize the net worth of every person in the room. I spent my childhood trying to perfect that dance. Looking at her now, surrounded by the elite society she worshipped, I finally understood the truth. Her grace was a weapon, and her reputation was a fragile glass house built on top of my stolen work. I took a deep breath, letting the cold reality settle in my lungs. The contrast between this opulent ballroom and the cramped Somerville apartment where I rocked Sophie to sleep felt vast and cruel. They threw a child out into the freezing dark so they could afford to buy expensive lights. I stepped out from behind the floral column and walked into the open floor. I did not hurry. I moved with slow, deliberate steps, holding the leather portfolio tightly against my hip. I wanted them to see me before I reached the center. I wanted the anticipation to curdle in their stomachs. A woman in a silver sequined dress turned around to grab a drink from a passing tray. It was my cousin Lauren. Lauren was a junior real estate broker who survived in the family by reporting back to my mother like a loyal soldier. She locked eyes with me. Her hand froze in midair. She did a frantic double take, her mouth falling open in shock. I did not blink. I offered her a slow, chilling nod. Lauren dropped her hand, spun on her heels, and practically sprinted across the polished floor toward Patricia. I watched the ripple effect. Lauren whispered frantically into Patricia's ear, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Patricia's benevolent smile vanished instantly. Her posture went rigid. Her head snapped toward me, locking onto my figure moving through the crowd. The predator had spotted the threat. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the carpet, forcing her to close the distance. She marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards underneath the rugs. The timeline caught up to the present second. We were back in the exact moment the nightmare started 8 years ago, but this time I held the execution warrant. "How dare you sneak in here?" she demanded. Her voice sliced through the nearby conversations. The words carried the familiar, icy contempt that once made me shrink into myself. She raised her jeweled hand and slapped me in front of the surrounding guests. The impact turned my face sideways. The sting was identical to the pain I felt in my father's office all those years ago. The smell of her jasmine perfume filled my nose, but the power dynamic had shifted entirely. I did not drop the portfolio beneath my arm. I did not reach for my cheek. I turned my head back and stared directly into her eyes. I did not see a powerful matriarch anymore. I saw a terrified woman realizing she no longer controlled my reactions. My father hurried over, pushing past a state senator. He did not ask if I was hurt. He seized my elbow with bruising force. "Leave through the kitchen," he hissed. "Do not embarrass this family tonight. We are closing the Vanguard deal." Harper materialized right behind him, wearing that stolen diamond bracelet, her lips curved into a smug, victorious smile. Security guards closed in around me, their heavy hands reaching out to grab my shoulders. My family thought I had come begging for scraps. They thought they were about to drag the crazy daughter out the back door and return to their triumph. They did not realize the guest seated beside the stage was waiting for his cue. Before the guards could pull me backward, a chair scraped violently across the marble floor. The noise shattered the tense murmurs of the crowd. Harrison Cole stood up. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket. His presence commanded absolute stillness from the room. He did not look at Harper or Patricia. He stared with lethal calm at my father. He raised one hand, halting the security team in their tracks. "Do you know who she is?" Cole asked. The ballroom went graveyard silent. The music stopped. My mother's face drained of color. My father's grip on my elbow went completely slack. His gaze dropped from Cole's face down to the worn leather portfolio under my arm. In that singular, terrifying moment, the illusion broke. William Miller looked at the documents, looked at the billionaire he was trying to con, and finally realized the ghost he tried to bury was holding the shovel. Harrison Cole did not wait for my father to answer. The billionaire took a slow, deliberate step away from the VIP table, leaving his untouched champagne behind. The security guards, caught between the hotel staff protocol and the command of the richest man in the room, instinctively lowered their hands. They stepped back, granting me a wide perimeter of empty space. Cole looked at the crowd, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom without the need for amplification. "Let me introduce our guest," Cole said. "This is Emma Miller. She is the lead external auditor for Vanguard Holdings, and she is running the financial autopsy on this acquisition." A collective intake of breath rippled through 300 guests. It was the sound of a high society ecosystem realizing a predator had just bypassed their fence. The venture capitalists, the politicians, the tech journalists, they all turned their focus from my father to me. The narrative my parents had carefully curated for 8 years shattered in a single sentence. I was no longer the tragic runaway addict. I was the financial auditor appointed by the very buyer my father was trying to deceive. My father's face turned the color of wet ash. He opened his mouth, but his throat seized. He had spent his entire career bullying subordinates and manipulating markets, but he had no script for a moment where his money could not buy silence. Patricia Miller possessed a different kind of survival instinct. She operated on decades of social warfare. When brute force failed, my mother deployed vulnerability. I had watched her use this exact tactic during my childhood. If a teacher questioned her parenting, she wept about the burden of her responsibilities. If a charity gala faced a funding deficit, she shed a single brave tear at the podium. She was a master of weaponized fragility. Right there, under the chandeliers, Patricia pivoted. The rigid, furious matriarch vanished. Her shoulders slumped. Her lower lip began to tremble. She reached out and grabbed my father's forearm, leaning against him, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Tears pooled in her eyes, catching the amber light with cinematic perfection. She dabbed the corners of her eyes, taking special care not to ruin her expensive makeup. "Harrison, please," Patricia said. Her voice was breathy, laced with a rehearsed maternal agony. She looked at Cole, pressing her jeweled hand to her chest. "You do not understand what is happening here. My daughter is very sick. We have spent years trying to get her help." She turned her tear-stained face toward the crowd, ensuring the journalists caught her performance. "She suffers from paranoid delusions. She has a history of severe substance abuse. It broke our hearts to distance ourselves, but she became unstable. And now she has been stalking our family. She is obsessed with Harper's success. Harrison, I am begging you as a mother, do not feed her delusions. She needs a hospital right now, not an audience." The ballroom wavered. Patricia's delivery was flawless. A few guests exchanged sympathetic glances. The narrative of a deranged, jealous older sister trying to ruin a tech prodigy's big night was a compelling storyline. If I had reacted with anger, if I had raised my voice to defend myself, I would have proven her right. Society expects a cornered woman to scream. Screaming is easily categorized as hysteria. I remained entirely stoic. I did not blink. I did not frown. I let her weeping echo across the silent room, allowing her to dig the grave deeper. I knew that the harder she sold the lie, the more devastating the truth would be when it landed. I unclasped the brass lock on the leather portfolio. The crisp sound cut through my mother's quiet sobbing. I slid out a single piece of thick, cream-colored paper. I stepped past my father, ignoring his flinching reaction, and walked over to a tall cocktail table illuminated by a direct overhead spotlight. I placed the document flat on the black tablecloth and stepped back. "It is fascinating," I said, keeping my tone as cold and level as a winter lake. A woman suffering from paranoid delusions usually does not possess certified documents from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The man standing closest to the table was a senior partner at a prominent venture capital firm. He leaned forward, squinting at the paper. It was the original patent filing for the predictive logistics algorithm. The date printed at the top was exactly 8 years ago, filed long before Harper even graduated from university. There, in stark black ink, was the undeniable proof. The software architecture Vanguard was about to purchase did not belong to Harper. The inventor line bore my printed name, and below it, my authentic signature. Beside the original filing, I placed a second sheet of paper. It was the patent transfer document Harper had submitted to the investors. It featured my signature as well, authorizing the handover of all intellectual property to her startup. But the ink told a different story. The final letter of my name curled upward with a distinct, sharp loop. It was a stylistic flourish Harper had used since high school. She had forged my consent to steal my life's work. The venture capital partner stared at the forgery. He looked up at Harper, his expression shifting from admiration to profound disgust. The whispers began. They started at the edges of the room and swept inward like a sudden draft. The guests were piecing the timeline together. They were realizing that the tech visionary they came to celebrate was nothing more than a thief wearing expensive clothes. William realized the room was slipping away. He scrambled to plug the hole in a sinking ship. He stepped in front of the cocktail table, trying to block the documents from the crowd's view. "This is a misunderstanding," William announced, forcing that booming laugh out of his throat again. It sounded hollow now, frantic and strained. "It is a simple clerical error from Emma's brief time as an intern. A misfiled patent application from years ago. We can clear this up with the legal department in the morning. Let us not let a clerical error ruin a night of celebration." He reached out to sweep the papers off the table. Before his fingers could graze the patent, Harrison Cole stepped forward and placed his own hand firmly over the documents. Cole did not smile. He did not laugh. Vanguard does not overlook clerical errors that alter the ownership of a 9-figure software asset, Cole said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the lethal weight of a corporate execution. The conflict shifted from physical removal to a battle of reputations, and my parents were losing ground by the second. The polished image they had protected by throwing me out into the cold was cracking wide open for Boston high society to witness. My mother's tears dried up. She stared at me with naked, unvarnished hatred, the mask finally slipping away. She realized I was not there to ask for forgiveness. I was there to audit their souls. Across the room, Harper watched the venture capitalist step away from her. She looked down at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. The stolen funds that bought her entry into this room were no longer a shield. She saw Harrison Cole standing next to me, validating my presence. She saw our father failing to control the narrative. The golden child realized she was about to be the one taking the fall. Harper Rapers refused to go quietly. She spun around, abandoning her glass of sparkling water, and marched toward the main stage. Her silk dress rustled sharply against the floorboards. She bypassed the audio technician, gripped the microphone stand, and pulled it toward her mouth. The speakers let out a sharp squeal of feedback, forcing several guests to cover their ears. Harper stood under the bright presentation lights, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal, preparing to launch a desperate, high-stakes counterattack. The feedback squeal from the microphone faded into the high vaulted ceiling. Harper stood under the bright presentation lights and smoothed the front of her champagne silk dress. She did not look panicked. She did not tremble. She possessed a terrifying ability to adapt her reality to fit her survival. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium, lowered her chin, and offered the room a brave, wounded smile. "I want to apologize to all of you," Harper said. Her voice was a soft, steady instrument designed to evoke sympathy. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of innovation and partnership. Instead, my older sister has chosen this stage to act out a very private, very painful family tragedy. She gestured toward the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. The hotel technicians operating on their standard event schedule dimmed the chandeliers. The towering screens behind Harper flared to life. Bright blue and silver graphics illuminated the dark room, displaying upward trending revenue charts, user acquisition metrics, and fake global partnerships. Harper turned back to the audience, framing herself against the glowing data. "Emma has always possessed brilliant technical skills," Harper continued, her tone dripping with rehearsed sorrow. "But she also possesses a deeply troubled mind. When she left the industry 8 years ago, she did not just walk away. She left a trail of unresolved resentment. I built this company from nothing. I poured my blood and sweat into this algorithm. Emma cannot accept that the younger sister she abandoned has built something successful." Harper pointed a manicured finger at the documents resting on the cocktail table. Do not let those papers fool you. My sister is a forensic analyst. She knows how to manipulate databases. She knows how to forge digital signatures and fabricate patent records. She hacked our internal servers out of jealousy. She wants to destroy my life because she walked away from her own. The ballroom wavered. Harper spoke with the polished, weaponized victimhood she had perfected over a lifetime. She offered the wealthy investors a comfortable lie to replace a messy truth. Corporate elites prefer a narrative that protects their money. The idea of a deranged, jealous sibling staging a dramatic revenge plot was much easier to swallow than a systemic, multi-million-dollar fraud hidden inside their portfolios. My mother recognized the shift in the room. Patricia capitalized on the momentum instantly. She wept softly into a linen handkerchief, leaning against a state senator for support. The performance was immaculate. The whispers in the crowd changed direction. Skeptical eyes turned away from Harper and fixed upon me. The venture capitalists murmured to one another, nodding slowly as Harper's charismatic defense took root. This was the critical tension point. This was the moment my family usually won. They threw a blanket of charm and status over their sins and suffocated the truth underneath. I stood in the center of the shifting tide, listening to the murmurs. I felt the collective doubt of 300 powerful people pressing down on my shoulders. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not deny the hacking accusations. A defensive posture always looks like guilt. Instead, I looked past the crowd, over the heads of the seated guests, toward the shadows of the audiovisual booth in the far back corner. David Sterling sat at the secondary control desk. He wore a dark suit, blending into the background. I offered him a single, subtle nod. I turned back to the stage. I stepped out of the spotlight and walked slowly toward the podium, forcing Harper to track my movements. The heavy silence returned. If you built this algorithm from nothing, Harper, then you can answer a simple diagnostic question, I said. My voice projected clearly without a microphone. Harper stiffened. Her eyes darted toward our father, seeking an escape route. William stood frozen, unable to intervene without looking guilty. You claim I hacked your servers to steal the credit. I continued, stopping 10 feet from the stage, but any software engineer knows their own architecture. Tell this room about the structural anomaly in the core processing loop. Explain the redundancy metric on line 4012. Harper gripped the podium tighter. She stared at me with wide, panicked eyes. She had spent years memorizing marketing buzzwords and rehearsing investment pitches. She knew how to sell the software, but she did not know how it actually breathed. She was a figurehead, standing on top of my stolen labor. It is a proprietary optimization feature, Harper stammered, her smooth delivery fracturing. It streamlines the synergy of the data flow. We implemented it to enhance the cloud architecture. A few seasoned technology investors in the front row frowned. They recognized the empty jargon immediately. Synergy and cloud architecture were terms used by salespeople, not the developers who wrote the foundational code. That is a fascinating explanation, I replied, because line 4012 does not process data. It does not optimize synergy. It is a dead loop. I looked back at the AV booth. David Sterling tapped his keyboard. The glowing charts on the massive screens behind Harper vanished. They were replaced by a stark black background filled with lines of dense, scrolling green code. The raw architecture of the logistics software loomed 20 feet high over the ballroom. 8 years ago, when I sat alone in a dark office drafting this prototype, I knew my father was watching my career, I said to the crowd. I knew he viewed my intellectual property as a family asset. So I embedded a ghost in the machine. Line 4012 is a hidden digital watermark. It serves no logistical purpose. It operates as a dormant sequence, waiting for a specific command prompt to activate. Harper looking over her shoulder at the scrolling code. The color drained entirely from her face. She stepped away from the podium, her hands trembling. If you wrote this program, Harper, tell the investors what the command prompt is, I challenged. Tell them what the sequence does. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The golden child was stranded on an island of her own lies, exposed in front of the very industry she tried to conquer. She looked out at the sea of faces, searching for a single person willing to rescue her. The tech journalists were already typing furiously on their phones. The venture capitalists stared at her with cold, calculating judgment. David Sterling executed the final command from the back of the room. On the giant screens, the scrolling code froze. A specific block of text highlighted in bright red. The sequence executed in real time. The redundant loop unraveled, shifting characters and reordering numeric values until a distinct pattern emerged on the display. The numbers translated into a date and a set of initials. E.M., followed by my exact birth date. It is a Fibonacci sequence that resolves into my initials and my birthday, I told the silent ballroom. A signature hiding in plain sight. A signature that has been sitting inside your flagship product for 8 years, surviving every fake update and offshore patch you paid for. The room erupted into chaotic murmurs. The fraud was no longer a theoretical debate or a family dispute. It was empirical, undeniable fact projected onto a cinema screen. The investors realized they had almost purchased stolen goods. The politicians realized they were standing in a room funded by an active criminal syndicate. Harrison Cole stood by the VIP table, his arms crossed, watching the Miller empire burn to ash. William Miller saw the venture capitalists backing toward the exits. He saw the Vanguard deal dying on the patterned carpet. The social and financial capital he had hoarded his entire life evaporated in the span of 3 minutes. He lost the public stage, and the realization shattered his polished facade. He reverted to the only tactic he had left: brute force. My father lunged across the floor. He did not care about the cameras or the staring eyes anymore. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug viciously into the nerves above my elbow, utilizing a painful, punishing grip designed to establish immediate physical control. "We are leaving," he snarled, his breath hot and ragged against my ear. He did not wait for me to step forward. He dragged me backward, throwing his weight against my frame. I stumbled, struggling to keep my balance in my heels. He pulled me away from the podium, away from Harrison Cole, and shoved me toward the heavy oak service doors located near the catering prep stations. The guests parted like water, too stunned by the sudden violence to intervene. My father pushed his shoulder against the wood, forcing the door open, and dragged me out of the bright, opulent ballroom into the dim, velvet-lined hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the crowd, sealing us together in the quiet dark for a private, vicious confrontation. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind us, slicing off the chaotic noise of the grand ballroom. We were standing in a secluded service corridor. The walls were lined with dark crimson velvet wallpaper designed to muffle sound. The air smelled of stale floor wax and cold drafts seeping in from the loading dock. My father shoved me backward. I stumbled but caught my balance against a brass light sconce. I adjusted the strap of my dress and looked at him. William Miller dropped his public face. The booming, jovial patriarch vanished. In his place stood the ruthless venture capitalist who viewed human beings as line items on a balance sheet. He did not yell. He never yelled when the stakes were truly high. He adjusted his silk bow tie and breathed heavily through his nose, calculating the exact cost of putting the fire out. "Name your price," he said. I stared at him. The question was not a surrender. It was a business transaction. He believed every person possessed a numerical breaking point. "I do not want your money," I told him. "Everyone wants the money, Emma." He took a step closer, crowding my physical space. "You made your point. You embarrassed Harper. You proved you wrote the code. Congratulations. Now we are going to fix this before Harrison Cole leaves the building. I will wire $2 million into a trust account in your name by tomorrow morning. I will draft a press release naming you as the Senior Vice President of Engineering. You get the title, the salary, and the equity. In exchange, You walk back into that ballroom, tell the crowd the algorithm was a joint family venture, and sign a non-disclosure agreement forbidding you from ever discussing the offshore accounts. He laid the offer out with practiced ease. It was the same tactic he used to buy out hostile competitors. He thought he was throwing a lifeline to a struggling single mother. He thought $2 million would erase 8 years of exile. I looked at the man who had ordered me to terminate my pregnancy. I thought about the winter nights I spent wrapped in a blanket in a freezing apartment, studying forensic ledgers while my daughter slept in a hand-me-down crib. I thought about the lunchbox I packed that morning. You want to buy my silence with the very money you stole from your own investors, I said. You want to pay me with toxic equity. It is generational wealth, he countered, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. It secures your future. It secures your child's future. You are a forensic analyst making a mid-level salary. You cannot afford to walk away from $2 million out of stubborn pride. Take the deal. We will clean up the accounting later. There is no cleaning up a $20 million deficit, I replied. Vanguard will audit the shell companies. The federal government will trace the wire transfers. Your empire is built on fraud, and it is collapsing tonight. I will not let my daughter inherit a legacy constructed from theft. She deserves a clean name. Williams stared at me. The transactional calm left his eyes. He realized the bribe had failed. The businessman retreated, and the predator stepped forward. He moved closer, pinning me against the velvet wall. He raised his right hand and pressed his knuckles against the wood paneling right next to my head. He wore a heavy gold signet ring bearing our family crest. He began to tap the metal against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. It was a calculated, rhythmic sound. When I was a teenager, that noise meant impending punishment. He used to tap that ring against the mahogany dining table whenever Harper or I stepped out of line. It was an auditory trigger designed to instill fear, a reminder of his unquestioned authority. He wanted me to revert to the frightened girl who flinched at his shadow. You think you hold the cards because you found a few routing numbers, he whispered, his face inches from mine. You think Cole will save you. You are forgetting who you are dealing with. If you do not walk back in there and fix this, I will not just destroy your career. I will take Sophie. The air in the corridor went dead. My father saw the shift in my eyes and smiled. It was a cold, reptilian expression. I have the best family law attorneys in the state on retainer, he continued, tapping the ring against the wall to emphasize his words. I will file an emergency petition for full custody tomorrow morning. I will present sworn affidavits from Patricia Harper and a dozen high society friends, testifying to your history of severe substance abuse and paranoid delusions. I will drag you through psychiatric evaluations, brutal depositions, and character assassinations until you are bankrupt. The courts favor the wealthy, Emma. I will paint you as an unfit, unstable mother who tried to extort her own family. The judge will hand your daughter to me, and you will never see her again. This was the darkest corner of his arsenal. He was weaponizing my child to protect his stolen money. He was using the lie they invented 8 years ago as a legal guillotine. I stood against the velvet wall. I listened to the rhythmic tapping of the gold signet ring. I focused on the sound. For 27 years of my life, that noise made my blood run cold. It signaled the end of negotiations. It meant I had lost. But right now, standing in the dim hallway of the Boston Harbor Hotel, the sound did not terrify me. It just sounded hollow. It was just a panicked old man knocking a piece of metal against wood. He had no real power left. He only had the illusion of intimidation. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not beg him to leave Sophie out of it. I reached my hand into the small black evening clutch resting under my left arm. My fingers closed around the smooth glass of my phone. I pulled the device out and held it up between us, turning the screen so the pale light illuminated his face. The screen displayed an active phone call. The timer read 42 minutes and 17 seconds. At the top right corner, a small red dot blinked steadily, indicating the audio was being captured and transmitted. William stopped tapping his ring. His eyes darted from the red recording dot to my face. When I met with Harrison Cole at the Vanguard headquarters, I told him you would attempt to bribe me, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I told him that when the bribe failed, you would escalate to extortion. Vanguard Legal requested a live audio feed of the event to ensure their internal compliance metrics were met. I tapped the speaker icon on the screen. "Are you still there, Mr. Sterling?" I asked. David Sterling's voice came through the phone speaker, crisp and clear, echoing slightly in the quiet corridor. "I am here, Emma. The Vanguard legal team is also on the line. We have recorded the $2 million bribery attempt, the admission of the accounting cover-up, and the threat of fraudulent litigation regarding your daughter. The files have already been backed up to the secure servers." My father stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened. The intimidating patriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered criminal, realizing he had just handed the prosecution his own confession. He tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords refused to work. He looked at the phone as if it were a loaded weapon pointed at his chest. "You spent my entire life teaching me that loyalty is transactional," I told him, dropping my phone back into my clutch. "You taught me to anticipate betrayal from the people who are supposed to protect you. I learned the lesson. I just learned it better than you did." He leaned against the velvet wall, his shoulders sagging, his hands shaking. He had nothing left to offer. He had no threats left to leverage. I had stripped away his money, his reputation, and his leverage in a single maneuver. I turned away from him and placed my hand on the brass handle of the oak doors. I did not look back. I pushed the heavy doors open, letting the bright light and the frantic noise of the ballroom spill over me. I left William Miller speechless in the shadows, stepping back onto the floor to finish what I started. If you have ever had a family member threaten the one thing you love most to protect their own lies, hit that like button and comment "unbreakable" below. Now let us get back to the ballroom. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and left the dim velvet-lined service corridor behind. The transition back into the grand ballroom felt like stepping out of a sensory deprivation tank and onto a live runway. The blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers washed over me, accompanied by the low, restless hum of 300 wealthy guests. The atmosphere had soured during my brief absence. The initial shock of my algorithmic ambush had settled into a thick, paranoid tension. I did not walk back to the center of the floor. I hugged the perimeter, my footsteps muffled by the thick floral carpet, and took up a position near a towering ice sculpture that had begun to melt. From this vantage point, I had a clear view of the entire chessboard. Harper was still standing behind the clear acrylic podium on the main stage. She looked like a sailor trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble. Her posture remained stubbornly rigid, but the effortless golden child charm had evaporated. A fine sheen of sweat caught the harsh stage lights across her forehead and collarbone. She was attempting a desperate salvage operation, speaking rapidly into the microphone about projected growth metrics, synergistic market scaling, and global logistics integration. She was throwing empty business jargon at a crowd of seasoned venture capitalists who were already calculating the legal liability of her deception. I caught the eye of David Sterling. He was seated in the shadows of the audio-visual booth, located on the raised platform at the back of the room. His hands hovered over the master control deck, his face illuminated by the pale glow of his dual monitors. I gave him a single, deliberate nod. On stage, Harper clicked her handheld presentation remote. She was attempting to transition to a slide showcasing their supposed European expansion strategy. The screen did not advance. She clicked the button again, applying more pressure, her manicured thumb pressing sharply against the black plastic. The digital projectors suspended from the ceiling hummed. The dual screens flanking the stage flickered, glitching in a sudden cascade of static pixels, and then went dark. A heavy murmur rippled through the crowd. Harper tapped the head of the microphone, the sound thumping dully through the speakers. "We are experiencing a slight technical difficulty," she announced, her voice pitching an octave higher than her carefully trained executive register. Please bear with us for just a moment. She aimed the remote directly at the receiver box and pressed the button 3 more times in rapid succession. The green laser pointer danced erratically across the dark screens, drawing frantic, meaningless loops. She was locked out of her own system. David Sterling bypassed the hotel network firewall and mirrored my encrypted flash drive directly to the main projectors. The dual screens flared back to life. They did not display Harper's glossy marketing materials. They displayed high-resolution scans of internal financial ledgers. The numbers towered 20 feet high, illuminating the ballroom in a harsh, unforgiving white glare. I watched the prominent investors in the front row squint, adjusting their designer glasses to read the projected data. It was the transaction history for Vanguard Holdings' initial earnest money deposit, a multi-million-dollar gesture of good faith meant to secure exclusive acquisition rights during the negotiation phase. The ledger traced the exact flow of that capital. The crowd watched the money enter the startup operating account, sit dormant for less than 48 hours, and then splinter into a dozen outbound wire transfers. The destination accounts were listed clearly in bold, black ink. They were offshore shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands under Oak Crest Partners. You could hear a pin drop on the carpeted floor. Finance professionals understand the language of ledgers better than they understand spoken words. They did not need me to grab a microphone and explain the crime. They were reading the anatomy of a felony in real time. The numbers detailed embezzlement so blatant it bordered on arrogance. They saw their own prospective investments bleeding out into foreign accounts controlled by the very family hosting the gala. Before Harper could formulate a defense, the slide transitioned. David executed the next phase of the sequence. The offshore routing numbers vanished, replaced by a series of internal email chains. The text was magnified, every word sharp and legible. The correspondence was between Harper and Patricia Miller. The timestamps dated back to the initial compliance phase of the Vanguard negotiations. My mother had always prided herself on leaving no paper trail. She preferred to conduct her manipulations over expensive lunches or quiet phone calls. But urgency creates mistakes. She had used her private corporate server to instruct her youngest daughter on how to bypass federal due diligence. The subject line read simply, "Credential verification." The body of the email exposed the mechanical heart of their fraud. Patricia wrote, "They will flag the lack of historical development data if they look too closely at your profile. We need to backdate the proprietary ownership today. Use Emma's old login credentials." I kept her original patent files on the home server. Copy her digital signature and overlay it on the new compliance forms. If anyone asks, she transferred the rights before her breakdown. Do not hesitate. Harper's response was displayed directly below, sent less than 20 minutes later. It took me 3 tries to get the loop on her signature right, but the forms are submitted. No one is going to question it. She is a ghost anyway. The cruelty of the exchange was laid bare for 300 people to read. They were not just discussing financial maneuvers or creative accounting. A mother and a sister were coldly planning to forge the identity of their discarded relative to pass a federal compliance check. The words hung in the air 20 feet tall, a digital monument to their corruption. The polished, philanthropic image Patricia had cultivated over 3 decades shattered against the undeniable proof of her own written instructions. The charity boards, the hospital wings, the society pages, none of it mattered anymore. She was exposed as the architect of a criminal enterprise. Harper stopped clicking the remote. Her hand dropped to her side. The clicker slipped from her grip and hit the wooden stage floor with a hollow plastic thud. She looked up at the towering emails, her breathing shallow and erratic. She tried to take a step away from the podium, but her heels seemed glued to the floorboards. The stage suddenly looked vast and isolating. There was nowhere to hide from the blinding light of the projectors. The ballroom descended into stunned silence. The clinking of champagne flutes ceased. The quiet chatter died in the throats of the guests. The catering staff stopped moving, freezing in place, with silver trays balanced on their fingertips. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a violent storm. It was the sound of a social empire suffocating under the weight of its own deception. The guests did not look at me. I was merely the messenger, standing quietly in the shadows. The truth was doing all the heavy lifting. Instead, the politicians, the venture capitalists, and the tech journalists slowly pivoted away from the stage. Their heads turned in unison, scanning the room until they found the architects of the lie. Their furious judging stares bypassed the disgraced golden child on the stage and locked on to the center of the ballroom. They fixed their gaze directly on Patricia and William Miller. The people who had laughed at my father's jokes and kissed my mother's cheek 10 minutes earlier now looked at them like they were carrying a contagious disease. The trap had sprung. The exits were blocked by the truth, and my parents were finally trapped in a room where their checkbook could not buy their way out. The silence in the grand ballroom did not break with a shout. It broke with the rustle of expensive fabric as 300 guests physically stepped away from William and Patricia Miller. The movement was subtle, but devastating. It was the choreography of self-preservation. In the high society circles of Boston, wealth is contagious, but scandal is terminal. The investors and politicians recognized the terminal diagnosis projected on the 20-foot screens. They were establishing a quarantine zone. Patricia recognized the shift instantly. For decades, my mother had survived by reading the currents of power and attaching herself to the strongest tide. She viewed loyalty as a depreciating asset. When a business venture failed, she fired the contractors. When a friend faced public ruin, she stopped returning their phone calls. Harper was her favorite daughter, her golden child, and her prized reflection. But standing in the center of the ballroom, under the crushing weight of federal fraud evidence, Harper was no longer an asset. Harper was a sinking ship. And Patricia Miller did not drown for anyone. I watched my mother execute the most stunning betrayal of her life. Patricia took a deliberate step away from my father. She turned her back toward the stage where Harper stood frozen. She raised her hands to her face, employing the same theatrical distress she used earlier, but this time the target was different. She looked at the senior venture capital partner standing nearest to her, her eyes wide with manufactured horror. We had no idea, Patricia cried, pitching her voice loud enough to carry across the tense room. We trusted our daughter. Harper told us the software was fully developed. She handled all the legal paperwork. William and I are just deceived parents. We gave her the seed money out of love, and she lied to us. As she spoke, her right hand drifted up to her collarbone. Her fingers found the strand of heavy pearls she wore layered beneath her emerald necklace. She began twisting the pearls, her thumb rubbing frantically against the smooth enamel. It was a pebble moment, a tiny, involuntary physical tell I had cataloged since childhood. Patricia always touched her pearls when she was constructing a lie that required immense concentration. Her fingers were trembling. She was throwing her favorite child to the wolves to save her own country club memberships. On the main stage, Harper heard the betrayal. The acoustics of the ballroom carried Patricia's defense directly to the podium. Harper turned her head slowly, staring down at our mother in the center of the crowd. The shock on Harper's face was profound and raw. She had spent her entire 23 years molding herself into the perfect daughter, stealing my work and committing felonies just to secure our parents' conditional affection. She believed she was their partner in the deception. In a single sentence, Patricia reduced her to a rogue criminal acting alone. Something inside the golden child snapped. The polished startup founder persona shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Harper grabbed the microphone from the stand with both hands. She did not bother with executive jargon or public relations spin. She leaned into the metal grid, her voice amplified and distorted by raw fury. "You are a liar," Harper screamed. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers, harsh and unrefined. "You drafted those signatures yourself. You sat in the home office on a Tuesday night and scanned Emma's driver license to bypass the notary lock. You told me the compliance officers were idiots who would never check the timestamps." Patricia gasped, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. "Harper, stop this right now. You are unwell. You are hysterical. I am quoting your own emails, Harper shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the giant screens displaying their correspondence. You told me we needed the Vanguard money to pay off the offshore deficit. You said Dad was leveraged to the breaking point on his commercial real estate loans in the Seaport District, and we were going to lose the house in Weston. Do not stand there and play the victim. You engineered the entire scam. The high society guests watched in horrified fascination. The elegant facade of the Miller family dissolved into a bitter, vicious street fight. The polished image they had protected by sacrificing my future was being torn apart by their own hands. William could no longer contain the fallout. The venture capitalists around him were already pulling out their phones, firing off urgent messages to their legal teams to halt any pending transfers. The politicians were signaling their aides, preparing rapid exit strategies to avoid being photographed near the epicenter of a federal crime. My father saw his empire turning to dust, and he lost his mind. Cut the power, William roared, spinning around to face the catering staff and the hotel management. Shut those screens off right now. Unplug the audio-visual equipment or I will sue this hotel into the ground. He charged toward the back of the room, aiming for the elevated AV booth where David Sterling sat. But Vanguard Holdings had anticipated the volatility of a cornered billionaire. Two broad-shouldered security contractors wearing discreet earpieces stepped directly into William's path. They did not draw weapons, but they crossed their arms and formed a solid wall of muscle, preventing my father from reaching the control deck. William hit the human barricade and rebounded, his face flushed a dangerous mottled crimson. He turned his rage back toward the center of the room. "Shut your mouth, Patricia," he yelled, pointing a rigid finger at his wife. "You left a digital paper trail for a felony. You documented a federal crime on a corporate server. I told you to handle the compliance protocols verbally." "I was protecting our assets," Patricia fired back, dropping the weeping mother routine entirely. Her voice turned shrill and venomous. "If you had not leveraged the Seaport properties against subprime commercial debt, we would not have needed to steal your daughter's algorithm to stave off a liquidity crisis." The three of them formed a triangle of mutual destruction. Harper weeping and screaming accusations into the microphone, Patricia shrieking about financial mismanagement, and William threatening lawsuits while trapped by security guards. They were tearing the flesh off each other's reputations, fighting for survival in a zero-sum game where everyone was already dead. I stood silently in the shadows near the melting ice sculpture, holding my leather portfolio. I watched a waiter carefully set down a silver tray of champagne glasses on a side table and step back against the wall, realizing he was witnessing the death of a dynasty. I did not need to step forward. I did not need to shout over their voices or defend my own name. The truth was a self-sustaining fire, and it was doing all the work for me. When you corner narcissists, you do not need to attack them. You only need to present them with a reflection they cannot control, and they will turn on each other to escape the mirror. For 8 years, they had remained perfectly united because they had me to use as a scapegoat. I was the dumping ground for their sins. Without my silence to anchor them, their fragile alliance collapsed under the weight of their own greed. They were showing Boston high society exactly who they were. The investors watched the psychological collapse with clinical detachment. The spectacle was ugly, unhinged, and thoroughly damning. No one rushed to comfort Patricia. No one offered William a sympathetic shoulder. They were pariahs, marked by the stench of failure and fraud. The screaming match reached a fever pitch. Harper leaned over the acrylic podium, sobbing uncontrollably, detailing exactly how William had instructed her to funnel the fake consulting fees through dummy tech vendors in offshore tax havens. She named the banks. She named the shell directors. Patricia covered her ears, shouting that Harper was having a psychiatric break and making up names to hurt them. Then the dynamic shifted one final time. Harrison Cole, who had been watching the disintegration with the cold, calculating eyes of an apex predator, decided he had seen enough. The Vanguard CEO stepped away from the VIP table. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and walked calmly toward the main stage. The crowd parted for him instantly. The room recognized where the actual power resided. Cole did not hurry. He ascended the carpeted steps on the side of the stage. Harper was still ranting into the microphone, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She did not notice Cole until he was standing less than 2 feet away from her. Harper froze, her mouth hanging open. She looked up at the billionaire she had spent the last 6 months trying to deceive. Cole did not speak to her. He did not yell. He simply reached out his hand and took the microphone gently from her shaking fingers. The final crushing blow was about to be delivered. Harrison Cole held the microphone. The ambient hum of the ballroom ceased entirely. 300 prominent investors and politicians held their breath. Cole did not tap the metal mesh or ask for attention. He simply let his presence command the space. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping past the crystal centerpieces and the melting ice sculpture before settling on my father. William Miller stood near the center of the room, flanked by the Vanguard security contractors. His chest heaved. He was waiting for Cole to offer a settlement, a quiet backdoor negotiation that billionaire executives usually favor to avoid public scandal. He expected Cole to demand a price adjustment. Vanguard Holdings is terminating the letter of intent to acquire this startup, Cole said. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the vast room. The termination is effective immediately, citing gross misrepresentation of intellectual property and systemic financial fraud. William opened his mouth to negotiate. Harrison, please. We can restructure the board tomorrow morning, he pleaded. We can remove Harper entirely. I will sign over the controlling voting shares to your firm at a steep discount. Cole did not entertain the counteroffer. The time for corporate restructuring expired the moment you attempted to package a $20 million felony and sell it to my shareholders, Cole replied. But a canceled check is the least of your concerns tonight, William. Cole shifted his attention to the giant projector screens illuminating the stage. David Sterling had left the internal emails and offshore bank routing numbers suspended in bright digital light. Cole pointed toward the data. When your daughter Emma brought this forensic audit to my office, she did not just ask me to walk away from a bad deal, Cole explained. She provided a pristine, documented trail of embezzlement. As the chief executive officer of a publicly traded conglomerate, I have a fiduciary and legal obligation to report confirmed fraud when it intersects with my corporate pipeline. Vanguard did not just reject your startup. We handed the entire audit over to the authorities. The air in the room grew heavy, thick, with the undeniable reality of federal intervention. In American business, lawsuits are survivable. Bankruptcies can be restructured. But federal fraud indictments are a terminal diagnosis. Cole delivered the lethal blow with surgical precision. For the past 48 hours, federal compliance officers and agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission have been inside the Miller family corporate headquarters, Cole announced. They bypassed your executive security team using federal warrants. They have cloned your servers, seized your physical hard drives, and frozen every commercial account tied to Oakcrest Partners. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are currently locked under international jurisdiction protocols. My father took a stumbling step backward. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He had spent the last 2 days planning his victory gala, selecting the expensive champagne, and shaking hands with state senators, completely unaware that federal agents were tearing his financial empire apart down to the drywall. The money you siphoned is gone, Cole continued, his tone devoid of pity. Your commercial real estate assets in the Seaport District are frozen pending forfeiture. The warrants for your arrest, along with warrants for Patricia and Harper, have already been issued. William Miller lost his physical strength. The towering patriarch who had ruled his family and his company through fear and financial manipulation crumbled. He reached out blindly, grabbing the back of a velvet dining chair. His knuckles turned white. He let out a ragged, wheezing breath and collapsed into the seat. He clutched his chest, his fingers bunching the fabric of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He was experiencing a severe panic attack, his heart struggling to process the sudden, catastrophic destruction of his entire reality. In a functional family, someone would have rushed to his side. A spouse would have called for a doctor. A child would have offered a glass of water. Nobody moved. Patricia Miller stood 5 feet away from her husband. She looked at him, clutching his chest, breathing heavily, and she did nothing. She simply tightened her grip on her pearl necklace and turned her face away, calculating her own legal exposure. She was already treating William as a liability. Her husband was a sinking ship, and she refused to be pulled under the water with him. The high society guests reacted with the same cold pragmatism. The venture capitalists, the journalists, and the politicians did not offer assistance. They recognized that the Miller family was radioactive. Standing near them invited federal subpoenas, an association with a high-profile financial crime. The crowd began a quiet, methodical exodus. There was no stampede. There was no shouting. It was a silent, coordinated retreat of the elite. Men in expensive suits and women in designer gowns turned their backs and walked swiftly toward the exit doors. They abandoned their half-empty champagne glasses on cocktail tables. They left their expensive coats in the cloakroom. They just wanted to erase their presence from the ballroom before the police arrived to execute the arrest warrants. The silence of the departing crowd amplified the magnitude of the fall. The heavy oak doors swung open and shut, swallowing the elite society my mother had dedicated her life to cultivating. Every time the door clicked, another powerful connection was severed. The state senator Patricia had donated thousands of dollars to walked out without a backward glance. The technology journalist Harper had been charming near the cocktail tables, was already typing a breaking news headline on his phone as he rushed down the hallway. The loyalty they had purchased with stolen money expired the exact second the money ran out. Within 2 minutes, the center of the grand ballroom was entirely empty. The illusion of popularity vanished. My parents were left stranded on an island of floral carpet, surrounded by discarded drinks and the glaring light of their own exposed crimes. They had lost their money, they had lost their social standing, and before the sun rose tomorrow, they would lose their freedom. The triad of American success they had worshipped their entire lives was stripped away, leaving them with nothing. I watched the devastation from my spot near the melting ice sculpture. I felt no triumph. I felt no desire to gloat. The hollow space in my chest, the wound they created when they threw me out 8 years ago, finally closed. I was no longer a victim of their ambition. I was the architect of their accountability. William continued to struggle for breath in the velvet dining chair. The irony was poetic and brutal. He had threatened to use his immense wealth and legal connections to drag me through family court and take my daughter away. He had tapped his gold signet ring against the wall, projecting invincibility. But invincibility is a fragile illusion when it relies on stolen funds. The federal government was currently dismantling his legal war chest. His bank accounts were frozen. His high-priced defense attorneys would require massive retainers he could no longer access. The predator who had cornered me in the hallway was now just a terrified old man facing a bleak future of depositions and jail cells. Harrison Cole did not stay on the stage to watch the final collapse. The Vanguard CEO had executed his role flawlessly, protecting his shareholders and neutralizing a toxic asset before it could infect his balance sheet. He walked down the carpeted stairs, signaling his security contractors. Cole paused briefly near my location, offering a single, respectful nod before heading toward the private exit. He left the Miller family to drown in the flood they had created. The stage was now empty, except for Harper. She stood under the glaring lights of the digital projectors. The scrolling code of my original algorithm illuminated her face in harsh green and white hues. The reality of her situation descended upon her like a physical weight. The federal prosecutors would not care about her country club status or her designer wardrobe. They would look at the forged signatures on the patent filings. They would trace the wire transfers she authorized to the offshore accounts. They would present the email chains where she mocked my exile and plotted the deception. She had handed the government a perfectly documented conspiracy. Harper realized her youth, her wealth, and her freedom were permanently extinguished. In the United States federal court system, wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and conspiracy carry severe mandatory minimum sentences. Harper realized she was not going to get a slap on the wrist. She was not going to pay a fine and quietly rebrand herself. She was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The golden child was dead. Only the criminal remained. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She looked at the abandoned champagne glasses and the empty chairs. The isolation was profound. When a narcissist loses their audience, their reality fractures. Harper had no audience left to manipulate. She only had the target of her rage. Her eyes tracked across the vast empty carpet until they found me. I did not shrink back into the shadows. I stepped out from behind the melting ice sculpture and met her gaze. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, holding the leather portfolio that contained the blueprint of her destruction. I was no longer the ghost she thought she had buried. I was the solid, unyielding wall she had just crashed her life into. Harper let out a raw, unhinged shriek. It was the sound of a cornered animal, realizing the trap was locked. She kicked off her expensive high heels, preparing to close the distance. Her manicured hands curled into tight claws. She was preparing for one last, desperate physical outburst, intending to inflict whatever violence she could manage before the authorities placed her in handcuffs. Harper abandoned the stage. She kicked away her designer heels, the sharp stilettos clattering against the polished wooden stairs. Her bare feet hit the thick floral carpet with heavy, uncoordinated thuds. The champagne silk dress, tailored to project effortless elegance, twisted around her legs as she sprinted across the empty dance floor. Her hands curled into tight claws, aiming directly for my face. She wanted to draw blood. She needed to inflict physical pain to offset the psychological obliteration she had just endured. 8 years ago, I would have cowered. When my father tapped his ring, when my mother raised her hand, I always shrank backward, attempting to minimize my physical presence. Tonight, my posture remained unbroken. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step in retreat. I held the leather portfolio against my side and watched my sister unravel. I knew I did not need to fight her. I had already won the war. Before Harper could cross the final 10 yards, 2 men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows near the catering entrance. Harrison Cole had departed, but he left his Vanguard security detail behind to ensure the transition of authority went smoothly. The contractors moved with terrifying fluid efficiency. They intercepted Harper mid-stride. One guard caught her right arm, the other secured her left, twisting her momentum and halting her charge instantly. Harper thrashed against their grip, throwing her weight forward, kicking her bare feet into the carpet. The guards did not strike her. They merely anchored her in place, immovable and indifferent to her status. "Let me go!" she shrieked. The sound did not just echo through the immediate vicinity. Harper had forgotten about the small wireless lapel microphone clipped to the neckline of her silk dress. The audio technician in the back booth had abandoned his post during the chaos, leaving the master volume faders pushed all the way up. Harper's shrieks fed directly into the hotel public address system, blasting through the overhead speakers positioned across the grand ballroom. The guests who had been hovering near the coat check and the exit doors paused. They turned their heads, drawn back toward the spectacle by the sheer volume of her breakdown. "You ruined everything," Harper sobbed, fighting against the security contractors. Her voice distorted through the speakers, sharp and metallic. "You were supposed to stay away. You were supposed to remain the failure." I stood 6 feet away from her, letting the silence answer. My refusal to engage only fueled her desperation. When a narcissist is denied a reaction, they detonate. I had to take it. Harper screamed, the hot microphone broadcasting her confession to the lingering elite. I did not want to steal the code, but he made me do it. She twisted her neck, glaring toward the velvet chair where William Miller sat, gasping for breath. She aimed her venom at the patriarch, who had shaped her into a criminal. "He only loves winners," she wailed, tears carving dark paths through her makeup. "You know that, Emma. You know how he looks at losers. He told me I had to secure the Vanguard deal or I was worthless. He said I was the only daughter he had left who could carry the legacy. I forged those documents because it was the only way he would look at me with pride. The words cascaded out of her raw and unguarded. The polished tech prodigy melted away, revealing a hollow, terrified child who traded her morality for a father's conditional approval. She confessed to federal offenses into a live audio feed, stripping away any remaining shadow of a doubt. The lingering venture capitalists and state politicians listened to the unfiltered anatomy of the Miller family dynamic. Harper was not finished. Her gaze snapped toward Patricia, who stood frozen near a cocktail table, twisting her pearl necklace in silent horror. "And you," Harper hissed, her voice cracking over the sound system. "You knew the algorithm was failing. You knew the offshore accounts were bleeding out. But you told me we had to keep smiling. You said we had to maintain the country club memberships and the charity board seats at all costs. You forced me to lie to those investors so you could keep buying emeralds and pretending you were royalty. You made me the face of this fraud." Patricia flinched, taking a physical step backward, as if her daughter's words were physical projectiles. The matriarch who had built an empire on pristine public relations was being eviscerated by her own creation. Harper was dismantling the illusion of their perfect family brick by brick, broadcasting the ugly transactional reality of their lives for the entire room to hear. The remaining guests watched in profound disgust. There was no glamour left to salvage. The wealth and privilege that usually insulated people of their caliber had been burned away, leaving a tragic, pathetic display of greed and parental failure. The elite society my parents worshipped turned away in final, irrevocable judgment. Then the heavy oak doors at the main entrance swung open. The Boston Police Department entered the ballroom. Vanguard Legal had initiated the call 30 minutes prior, coordinating with federal compliance officers to execute the pending warrants. 4 uniformed officers walked onto the floral carpet, their tactical belts rattling softly in the quiet room. 2 plainclothes detectives followed close behind, scanning the chaotic scene. The lead detective approached the security contractors holding Harper. He produced a pair of steel handcuffs. "Harper Miller," the detective stated, his voice calm and authoritative. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and intellectual property theft." The security guards released her arms, transferring custody to the police. Harper stopped thrashing. The cold touch of the steel cuffs snapping around her wrists seemed to break the fever dream she was trapped inside. She looked down at the metal bindings, her chest heaving, the reality of her ruined future finally setting in. Across the room, 2 more officers approached William. My father was still slumped in the velvet dining chair, clutching his chest. A paramedic followed the officers, checking his vitals quickly before helping him to his feet. They did not treat him like a respected venture capitalist. They treated him like a flight risk. An officer pulled William's arms behind his back and secured his wrists in handcuffs. The polished patriarch stumbled, his custom tuxedo wrinkling, as they guided him toward the exit. It was a poetic reversal of the opening scene. Less than an hour ago, my parents had weaponized hotel staff to throw me out of this very room, believing they controlled the doors. They had ordered me to leave through the kitchen to spare them embarrassment. Now, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the hotel driveway outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The authorities were escorting William and Harper out through the main lobby, parading their disgrace in front of the lingering guests, the valet staff, and the journalists. The ballroom emptied rapidly behind them. The police cleared the remaining attendees, securing the space as an active crime scene. The catering staff vanished into the service corridors. The audiovisual technicians shut down the glowing projectors, plunging the stage into darkness. The grand, opulent space grew vast and quiet. Only 2 people remained on the floor. Patricia Miller stood near the center of the room. Her emerald necklace still caught the dim overhead light, but the aura of power she had wielded for decades was gone. She was entirely alone. Her husband was on his way to a holding cell. Her favorite daughter was facing federal prosecution. Her high society peers had abandoned her. The charity boards would demand her resignation by morning. The bank accounts were frozen. The house in Weston would soon be seized. She had sacrificed her eldest daughter to protect a beautiful lie. Tonight the lie shattered, leaving her with nothing but the cold truth of her own choices. I stood a few yards away, watching her. I did not feel pity. I did not feel the need to offer a parting monologue or demand an apology. Some victories do not require words. The silence of the empty ballroom was a heavier sentence than any insult I could deliver. Patricia looked up, meeting my eyes. Her lips parted. She reached one hand out toward me, a desperate, trembling gesture, seeking an anchor in the wreckage. I adjusted my grip on the leather portfolio. I turned my body toward the main exit doors. I placed one foot in front of the other, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood border of the floor. I walked past my mother. I kept my gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge her outstretched hand. I did not speak a single syllable. I left her, standing in the center of the ruins, a ghost haunting a life that no longer existed. I pushed the heavy brass handles of the hotel doors, stepped out into the crisp Boston night air, and left the building behind. The sun rose over Massachusetts with a quiet, unhurried grace. I sat at my small kitchen table. The frantic energy of the grand ballroom belonged to another lifetime. My apartment smelled of roasted coffee beans and morning frost. There were no crystal chandeliers here. There were no hired string quartets playing background music for a tragedy. There was only the steady, rhythmic drip of my old coffee maker. I wrapped my hands around a ceramic mug and let the warmth seep into my skin. For the first time in 8 years, I was not looking over my shoulder. The shadow my parents cast over my life had finally vanished with the dawn. I unlocked my tablet and pulled up the financial news feeds. The story had already ignited across every major media platform. The headlines did not feature the polished, curated photographs my mother usually distributed to society bloggers. The images plastered across the screen showed William Miller sitting in the back of a police cruiser, his head bowed, his custom tuxedo wrinkled and defeated. The articles detailed the sweeping collapse of the Miller Technology Syndicate. Financial reporters dissected the offshore routing numbers I had projected onto the hotel screens. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally announced multiple federal indictments. The business world reacted with ruthless speed. The stock value of my father's primary holding company plummeted to zero before the opening bell even rang. Institutional investors liquidated their positions, abandoning the sinking vessel. The wealth he had hoarded, the capital he used to intimidate and control his children, evaporated into digital dust. The consequences were swift and unsparing. William was no longer a titan of industry. He was a cautionary tale, broadcast across every financial network in the country. The destruction extended far beyond the stock market. I read a brief press release issued by the Boston Children's Hospital Foundation. The board of directors held an emergency midnight session. They voted unanimously to remove Patricia Miller from her position as chairwoman. 3 other elite charity organizations followed suit by sunrise. Her name was scrubbed from their websites. The society peers who had kissed her cheek just 12 hours earlier now treated her legacy like a biohazard. Patricia had spent her entire adult life treating public perception as her only currency. Today, she was bankrupt in the only economy she understood. She was sitting alone in her sprawling mansion in Weston, waiting for the federal forfeiture notices to arrive. The grand house that had served as the headquarters for her social manipulations was destined for the auction block. Meanwhile, Harper was spending her morning in a concrete holding cell. The federal prosecutor denied bail, citing her as a flight risk, given her access to foreign accounts. The golden child, who had traded her soul for a fake title and a diamond bracelet, was now wearing a standard-issue uniform. She was sitting on a metal bench awaiting her formal arraignment on conspiracy charges. Her tech prodigy facade was gone. She was just another criminal facing the crushing weight of the federal justice system. At 8 a.m, my phone vibrated against the table. It was my attorney, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Sarah. She did not call to congratulate me. We had concrete logistics to finalize. During our brief conversation, I authorized Sarah to file permanent protective orders against William, Patricia, and Harper. The court filings detailed the physical intimidation in the hotel hallway, the threat to manipulate custody laws, and the historical pattern of psychological abuse. I was legally sealing the border between their world and mine. A piece of paper might not stop a bullet, but it created an undeniable legal perimeter. If any of them attempted to approach my home, my office, or my daughter's school, the police would arrest them on sight. I was building a fortress out of certified court documents, ensuring my family could never weaponize their desperation against me. Sarah informed me that several high-profile journalists were requesting exclusive interviews. Network producers wanted me to sit in front of a camera and recount the betrayal. They wanted tears, dramatic pauses, and sensational quotes. They offered lucrative compensation for the exclusive rights to my story. I declined every single request. My mother had spent decades manipulating the media to shape her reality. My father had used the press to destroy his rivals. I refused to play the game they loved so much. I did not need a magazine cover to validate my existence. I did not need public sympathy to heal. The truth was already published in the federal indictments, and that was the only record that mattered. I instructed Sarah to issue a standard no comment to all press inquiries. The silence was my final verdict. I set my tablet face down on the table. The sudden absence of conflict felt strange. For 8 years, survival had been my primary occupation. I had built my career, my home, and my identity around the necessity of outsmarting predators. Now the adrenaline crash hit me. A hollow space opened up in my chest. It was the space where a loving father, a nurturing mother, and a loyal sister should have lived. In normal families, those roles are filled with shared memories and unconditional support. In mine, the space had been occupied by fear and vigilance. I sat in the quiet kitchen and examined that void. I expected to feel a profound sense of mourning for the family I had just dismantled. Instead, I felt nothing but a clean, sweeping relief. There was no grief, because you cannot mourn something you never truly possessed. You can only feel relief when the heavy burden is finally lifted. I stood up and carried my empty ceramic mug to the sink. The mug was chipped near the handle. It was an inexpensive piece of pottery I had purchased at a thrift store during my first month in the Somerville apartment. I turned on the faucet. The warm water ran over my hands, washing away the residue of the coffee. I focused on the sensation. I listened to the steady sound of the water hitting the stainless steel drain. It was a simple, mundane task, yet in that specific moment, it felt like a profound luxury. I was appreciating the absolute silence of a life no longer monitored. No one was judging the brand of my coffee. No one was critiquing the chip in my cup. No one was plotting to use my existence as a shield for their own crimes. The silence was not empty. It was secure. It was a testament to the boundaries I had drawn and the peace I had earned. I turned off the faucet and set the mug on the drying rack. I dried my hands on a cotton towel. Behind me, I heard the soft, familiar padding of small feet walking across the hallway floorboards. The kitchen door swung open with a gentle creak. Sophie walked into the room. She was wearing her oversized fleece pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. She raised small fists to rub the lingering exhaustion from her eyes. She let out a quiet yawn and looked up at me. She did not know about the forged signatures or the offshore accounts. She did not know her grandfather was in handcuffs or her grandmother was a social pariah. She was entirely unaware of the empire that had fallen overnight to keep her safe. She just saw her mother standing in the kitchen, ready to start the day. Harrison Cole did not wait for the dust to settle. 2 weeks after the Boston Harbor Hotel incident, his executive assistant requested my presence at Vanguard headquarters. I returned to the 42nd floor boardroom. The space felt different this time. I was no longer a shadow analyst bringing a warning. I was a recognized equal. Cole sat at the head of the marble table, reviewing a thick-bound dossier. He closed the folder, aligned it parallel to the edge of the desk, and looked up. "You executed the extraction flawlessly," Cole said. "You protected my shareholders and neutralized a severe liability. But looking over the source code you brought me, I realized Vanguard still needs the algorithm. We just do not need the criminals who stole it. Cole leaned forward and presented a formal contract. He did not offer me a fake vice president title or a quiet bribe to disappear. He offered me the position of Chief Strategy Officer for Vanguard Holdings. The compensation package included full funding for a corporate litigation team to legally reclaim my stolen patents from the federal government's seizures. He was offering to restore my intellectual property and pay me its true market value. My father had attempted to buy my compliance with toxic money. Cole was offering legitimate prosperity built on transparency and mutual respect. I picked up the silver pen and signed my name on the final page. In a single stroke of ink, I secured generational stability for Sophie without sacrificing a single ounce of my integrity. I took the executive position, moved into a corner office overlooking the harbor, and went to work. The legal machinery ground forward over the next 6 months. The justice system operates slowly, but it crushes whatever it catches in its gears. William remained in federal custody pending trial, his requests for bail repeatedly denied by a judge who deemed him a flight risk. Harper negotiated a plea agreement, trading her cooperation against our father for a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. They were locked in cages of their own design, turning on one another in federal proffer sessions, just as they had turned on each other in the ballroom. Patricia faced a different kind of prison. My mother was not indicted on the primary wire fraud charges. The federal prosecutors determined she acted as an accessory after the fact, allowing her to avoid a cell. But avoiding prison did not save her. The Securities and Exchange Commission drained her remaining accounts to pay restitution. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling estate in Weston. The woman who used to dictate the social calendar for the Boston elite was forced into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. She spent her days fielding calls from civil litigators representing the defrauded investors. Her emeralds were auctioned off. Her designer gowns were sold on consignment. She was living the exact life of isolation and financial panic she had forced upon me 8 years earlier. The symmetry was ruthless. A cornered manipulator will always search for a new host. 6 months after the gala, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived on my desk at Vanguard. The mailroom had flagged it as personal correspondence. I recognized the elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting immediately. It was Patricia. She had mailed the letter directly to my corporate headquarters, bypassing the protective orders by claiming it was a professional inquiry. I held the heavy cardstock in my hands. The faint scent of her jasmine perfume still clung to the paper. It was a calculated sensory tactic, designed to trigger childhood nostalgia and guilt. I did not need to break the wax seal to know what was written inside. I knew her playbook by heart. The letter would begin with a fragile apology, carefully phrased to avoid taking direct responsibility for her actions. She would describe her cramped apartment, the smell of cheap paint, and her failing health. She would paint herself as a victim of William's ambition, claiming she only stayed silent out of fear. The final paragraph would contain the hook. She would ask to meet Sophie. She would request a small financial loan to cover her mounting legal fees, promising to pay it back once the dust settled. She would weaponize the concept of family forgiveness to pry open the door I had bolted shut. In American society, there is a pervasive narrative that victims must forgive their abusers to find peace. We are told that holding on to anger is a poison and that blood dictates endless second chances. It is a philosophy invented by predators to guarantee their targets remain accessible. I looked at the elegant handwriting on the envelope. My pulse remained steady. I did not feel a spike of anger or a wave of lingering guilt. The adrenaline of the past 8 years had faded, leaving a calm, impenetrable resolve. I realized that true healing does not require reconciliation. You do not have to sit at a table with the people who starved you. Some doors must remain permanently locked to protect the warmth inside your own home. I picked up a black marker from my desk organizer. I untapped it and drew a thick, dark line through my printed name. Underneath her return address, I wrote 3 words in block letters: Return to sender. I dropped the envelope into the outgoing mail tray. I did not read her excuses. I did not grant her the satisfaction of an audience. I let her manipulative apology travel right back to the cramped apartment, forcing her to sit alone with her silence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window in my office. The glass was cool against my fingertips. The Boston skyline stretched out before me, bathed in the soft golden light of the late afternoon. Traffic crawled along the bridges, a steady stream of red taillights moving across the harbor. The city looked different from this altitude. It looked navigable. I stood there and reflected on the night of the gala. I thought about the exact moment my mother crossed the hand-knotted rug and struck my face. At the time, the sound had echoed like a cracked whip. The sting had radiated down my neck. But standing in my corner office, I realized the slap did not actually hurt. It contained no real power. It was not a display of authority. It was the desperate, flailing reflex of a dying system. It was the physical manifestation of a woman realizing her words no longer controlled my reality. My parents had spent their entire lives treating power like a bludgeon. They used it to crush dissent and silence inconvenient truths. They believed whoever yelled the loudest or spent the most money won the argument. I had defeated them by harnessing a different kind of strength. I used patience. I used meticulous documentation. I built impenetrable boundaries and let their own arrogance do the heavy lifting. The rewards of outsmarting abusers do not arrive in a single moment of triumph. They arrive in the quiet, steady accumulation of safe days. I checked the silver watch on my left wrist. It was 5 p.m. The workday was finished. I did not need to stay late and hide in the basement server room anymore. I did not need to fear a sudden phone call from a blocked number. My perimeter was secure. I gathered my laptop and slipped it into my leather bag. I turned off the overhead lights, plunging the office into a serene, quiet shadow. I walked out of the glass doors and headed toward the elevator bank. I was going home to cook dinner. I was going home to my daughter. The war was over, and the final chapter of our story was waiting for me at the kitchen table. I woke up on a Sunday morning to the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window of my Somerville apartment. The rain provided a steady, calming soundtrack to the start of the day. I had not moved into a sprawling estate, even with the Vanguard compensation package securing our financial future. I liked the cozy, secure walls of this home. I stood at the stove, pouring batter onto a hot cast-iron skillet. The smell of melting butter and maple syrup filled the small space. It was a simple, domestic fragrance, far removed from the heavy scent of roasted tenderloin and jasmine perfume that defined my former life. I listened to the coffee maker hiss and sputter, signaling the end of its brewing cycle. The radiant heat from the stove warmed my hands. This small kitchen in Massachusetts held more authentic joy than the sprawling Weston estate ever could. I flipped a pancake, watching the edges turn golden brown. The quiet rhythm of the morning felt like a profound victory. I carried a stack of warm pancakes to our small, round dining table. It was made of scuffed pine purchased from a local hardware store years ago. There was no polished mahogany. There were no heavy velvet chairs. The mahogany table in my childhood home sat 12 people. It was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the crystal glasses and silver cutlery set by the catering staff. In my father's house, the dining table was a battlefield. Meals were silent, tense affairs. We were trained to chew without making a sound and to speak only when addressed by William. Seating arrangements were dictated by your current value to the family brand. If you secured a lucrative contract, you sat to his immediate right. If you embarrassed them, you were relegated to the far end or removed entirely. Every dinner was a performance review. Every conversation was a test. Here in my kitchen, there were only 2 mismatched wooden chairs. There was no head of the table. There was no hierarchy. There were no conditions required to earn a serving of breakfast. Sophie walked into the kitchen wearing her oversized fleece pajamas. She climbed into her chair and reached for the syrup. I watched her pour a generous amount over her plate. She did not ask for permission. She did not check my expression to ensure she was behaving perfectly. She just ate her breakfast, her feet kicking happily under the table. She was safe. She would never know the cold, calculating gaze of William Miller. She would never feel the sting of Patricia Miller's conditional affection. I had absorbed all of their toxicity and locked it away in federal court documents, ensuring the poison stopped with my generation. After she finished eating, Sophie ran back to her bedroom and returned with a piece of construction paper. She slid it across the pine table toward me. It was a drawing done in bright crayon. It depicted the two of us standing outside a house with a yellow sun in the corner. The lines were crooked and the colors bled outside the boundaries. It was imperfect, chaotic, and beautiful. In my childhood, if I presented a drawing to my mother, she would point out the flaws. She would tell me to practice my shading or use a ruler to make the lines straight, preparing me for a world where only flawless execution was tolerated. I looked at Sophie's drawing and smiled. I told her it was wonderful. I praised her use of color. I praised her imagination. My warmth was genuine and unforced. I did not praise her to build a prodigy. I praised her to build a child who knew she was loved exactly as she was. Sophie carefully selected a magnet shaped like a bright red apple and secured her masterpiece to the white enamel of the refrigerator door. She stepped back, tilting her head to admire her work. Her pride was radiant and untainted by the fear of criticism. She spun around, ran back to the table, and took another bite of her syrup-soaked breakfast. I sat at the table holding my coffee mug. The journey from the freezing dark of an 8-year exile to this warm, sunlit kitchen was long and brutal. I thought about the price of my freedom. Exposing my parents under the chandeliers of the Boston Harbor Hotel did not magically rewind the clock. Taking down their fraudulent empire did not give me back my 20s. It did not erase the nights I spent crying on the floor of a cramped apartment, terrified of failing my daughter. It did not return the years I spent working night shifts while my peers were building their social lives. Revenge, even the most justified kind, does not repair the past. But it achieved something far more important. It prevented them from stealing my future. It stopped them from using my name to fund their lies. It proved that their rejection had never been a measure of my worth. Their rejection was simply a measure of how dangerous my truth was to their illusion. Society often preaches that family is a sacred bond, an unbreakable bloodline that demands your loyalty regardless of the cost. I learned a different truth. Family is not a bloodline that gets to demand your silence to protect their comfort. Family is a table you build yourself. You get to choose the wood. You get to choose the chairs. Most importantly, you get to decide who is allowed to sit with you. You fill those seats with people who want you to speak, people who celebrate your voice, instead of forcing you to whisper. My father tried to force me out through the kitchen doors to hide his shame. My mother slapped me to enforce her authority. They believed they held the power because they controlled the invitations to the grand ballroom. They did not understand that I stopped wanting their invitation a long time ago. I walked out of their ballroom because I had a better table waiting for me at home. I looked at the colorful drawing taped to the refrigerator. I thought about Harrison Cole offering me the executive position. I thought about Harper sitting in a holding cell, grappling with the reality of her choices. I thought about Patricia in her downsized apartment, writing manipulative letters that would never be opened. They were trapped in the wreckage of the empire they tried to build on my back. I was free. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Healing does not always look like forgiveness. Sometimes healing looks like a permanent restraining order and a successful career. Sometimes healing is simply the quiet realization that the people who hurt you no longer hold any power over your pulse. The ghost they created had returned, reclaimed her name, and walked away in the sunlight. If you have ever had to walk away from the table you were born at to protect the table you are building, tell me in the comments. Would you have handed them the evidence privately, or would you have let the whole ballroom see the truth? Let me know below. Subscribe if this story resonated with you. And remember, choosing yourself is not betrayal, it is survival.